Some battles aren't fought with fists. They're fought with the quiet strength of refusing to back down. When a black CEO is unfairly asked to give up her seat for a wealthy passenger on a first-class flight, she refuses to bow to his privilege. What follows is a tense standoff that goes unnoticed by most, but ultimately will shake the foundation of the powerful airline. The higher the stakes, the more it reveals about the truth that lies beneath privilege and power. How will this dispute unfold when the very people in charge are forced to face their biases? Before we go any further, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe. You won't want to miss tomorrow's story. It's one that will make you rethink everything you know. Lacey Christensen didn't blink when the private car door was opened for her. She simply stepped out, heels steady on the tarmac, eyes shielded behind narrow tortoiseshell frames. Her movements were sharp, intentional, as if the air around her was waiting for permission to move. Her assistant, Marcus, scrambled behind her, cradling a slim leather case, like it held national secrets. It kind of did. Inside were documents that could collapse fossil fuel stocks in 3 continents. Not that Lacey cared about stocks, she cared about impact. And this flight? This flight was her bridge to it. Ma'am, Altura Prestige Suite 1A, we've confirmed your dietary notes, work table setup, and we've added the extra diffuser you like. Sandalwood blend, correct? The ground staff manager looked nervous, even though she recited her lines with precision. Lacey offered a small nod. That was all she gave when things were as expected. She climbed the steps of Flight 927, not because it was glamorous, but because the jet bridge was closed for a security sweep. She didn't mind the stairs. They reminded her of the climb. 39 years old, hair in tight coils pulled into a smooth, low bun, skin the shade of polished mahogany. Her presence came not from noise, but from clarity. The kind of clarity that made boardrooms fall silent. The kind that couldn't be taught, only earned. As she entered the aircraft, the scent hit her first. Crisp bergamot, with a hint of vanilla leather. Subtle luxury. Custom scenting was one of the signatures of Altura Skies' prestige cabin. But this time the air didn't just smell expensive, it smelled like precision. Suite 1A was where the ceiling curved differently, where the overhead compartments didn't exist because in 1A you didn't carry your own luggage. It was already waiting, organized, monogrammed if you were that kind of person. Lacey wasn't. She slid into her suite without hesitation. She didn't pause to admire the brushed carbon fixtures or the gold thread stitching in the privacy curtain. She reached for her tablet, flicked open the screen, and without even turning around, said, "Marcus, send the deck to Karsten. Use the revised growth rate. Assume the Swiss are going to ask about India's regulation hold." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied from the doorway, already tapping. He didn't ask if she needed anything. Lacey didn't need asking. She created clarity, and the people around her adapted or disappeared. After a brief nod, Marcus turned and left. Lacey leaned back, letting her head rest for the first time that week. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Not real sleep. Just blinking long enough to imagine sleep. The Geneva deal was 2 years in the making. Solvanta Energy's merger with the Heliox Group would give her enough leverage to shift power grids across Europe and displace 3 monopolies while she was at it. She didn't need the money. She needed the legacy. She glanced briefly toward the aisle. Other VIP passengers were filtering in, some already sipping champagne, some still preening for attention. One woman, wrapped in head-to-toe beige cashmere, faked laughed into a phone call that had ended 5 minutes ago. A man in square sunglasses held a copy of the Financial Times, but hadn't flipped a page in 10 minutes. Noise. Harmless, predictable noise. Then came the click. Not the sound of a shoe, not a curtain. The sound of someone clearing their throat, not to get attention, but because they already believed they had it. "You might be in the wrong place." The voice came from just outside her privacy screen. Crisp, measured. drenched in the kind of tone that only years of private schooling and zero real consequences could produce. Lacey didn't look up immediately. She swiped to the next slide on her deck, annotated a projection curve. Then, with an unhurried breath, she tapped her screen to black, turned toward the entrance of her suite, and raised her eyes. A man stood there, easily late 50s, with the kind of smirk that suggested his hands had never touched a steering wheel. His hair was combed with surgical precision, pale enough to blend with the collar of his sky-hue shirt. His blazer was ivory, custom, monogrammed buttons, and, on his left pinky, a family crest glistened in gold. Lacey offered no expression. "Excuse me." The man gestured toward her seat. "This is Suite 1A. There must have been a mix-up. My assistant always books it." Lacey reached into the side pocket of her seat, retrieved her boarding slip, and held it up without rising. "Suite 1A, Lacey Christensen. That's me." His eyes flicked to the name, paused. "You're Elijah?" he asked, clearly thrown. "No," she said flatly. "Lacey Christensen." He hesitated. Something danced behind his eyes, an ugly mix of confusion and entitlement. Then he laughed. Just a puff of air, a fake sound people use when they're trying to make themselves seem bigger than the moment. "There must still be a mistake. You see, I fly this route all the time. Altura always reserves this suite for me. It's tradition." He was trying to charm her. She could tell by the way he leaned in slightly. That lean was a mistake. Lacey tilted her head. "And traditions mean more than reservations?" He blinked. "Look, I'm sure the crew can sort it out. Maybe they moved you to another suite, one of the ones on the right side." Ah, there it was. The right side. She was still staring at him when the curtain behind him shifted, and the lead flight attendant appeared. Heather Gaines wore a polished smile and a platinum Altura pin that caught the overhead light. She was in her mid-40s, professionally poised, and practiced in the art of surface kindness. "Is there an issue here?" she asked brightly, glancing between the two. "Yes," the man said immediately, not even looking back. "I think this young lady is in my seat." Lacey's brows didn't move. Heather turned to her, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Recognition? Doubt? Whatever it was gone in seconds. "Mrs. Christensen," Heather said with a light, almost patronizing tone. "Would you mind letting us double-check? There might have been a seat duplication." "There wasn't," Lacey replied. "I understand. It's just a quick check." "You're welcome to check," Lacey said, still seated. "I'm not moving." The man's eyebrows jumped, offended. "Look, this doesn't need to become a scene," Lacey finished, eyes unblinking. "Then I suggest you stop making one." Heather stiffened slightly. Lacey turned her screen back on. 7 seconds passed. Heather cleared her throat again. "Perhaps if you just—" "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Lacey said, not raising her voice, but turning her head just enough for the steel in her words to land. "He's not." Silence. Then Heather gave a tight smile. "Understood. I'll speak with the service desk." And just like that, she disappeared behind the curtain. The man didn't. "I'm Preston Langford," he said, as if the name itself was currency. "I don't carry change," Lacey replied. He stared at her, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. That made two of them. Except Lacey didn't need to speak. She had already won this round. Quietly, firmly, and yet something about the way Heather had handled it didn't feel like a closed door. It felt like a storm front, which meant this flight wasn't done revealing its turbulence just yet. Lacey didn't watch Preston Langford walk away. She didn't need to. The energy in the cabin shifted as soon as he turned, that heavy, indignant huff some men make when they're denied something they were never owed. She could feel it, even through the plush soundproofing of the suite walls. It pressed at the edges of her calm like static, but she let it pass, like she always did. She slid her noise-canceling panel back into place. Not the mechanical one. It was internal, a discipline. You don't get to run billion-dollar deals and sleep well at night without the ability to compartmentalize. She breathed in, slow and deep. The sandalwood diffuser had activated while she was dealing with Langford. The scent filled the small suite with warmth and memory. Reminded her of her grandmother's house in Baltimore, summer nights when the windows were open and stories stretched into the stars. This wasn't the first time someone thought she didn't belong. It wasn't even the 100th. But something about being questioned here, in this space she'd earned 10 times over, still scratched at a place deeper than annoyance. Lacey pressed her thumb to the biometric reader on the panel to her right. The privacy dome engaged with a soft hum, arching above her seat like a shell. The light dimmed automatically to her preset comfort level, and the recliner adjusted 3 degrees back, sensing her posture had shifted. She picked up her tablet again, tapped it to life, and pulled up the Heliox projections. Bar graphs and energy market forecasts bloomed across the screen in fluid animations. There were numbers that would scare a lot of people. Collapse of coal dependencies in southeastern Europe, lithium sourcing chokeholds, grid destabilization risks in post-conflict zones. But to Lacey, it was art. Each line and data point told a story about change, resistance, and the space between. She was fluent in that space. She lived there. A soft knock. Not a fist knock. A finger knock. Careful. Hesitant. She didn't respond right away. Miss Christensen? It was a male voice this time, younger, more uncertain. She sighed quietly and tapped the dome control to lower it. A flight attendant, early 30s, clean-shaven, with a professional half-smile, stood just outside the suite, holding a tray. "Your pre-departure refreshment?" he said, gently placing it on the ledge beside her. She looked at the glass. Not champagne this time, sparkling elderflower, exactly what she'd requested in her travel preferences. "Thank you," she said, nodding once. He hesitated a beat longer than necessary. I just wanted to say," he added, lowering his voice slightly, "I saw what happened. That wasn't right." Lacey looked up at him. The man's face was trying to stay neutral, but the corners of his mouth had folded into something softer. Regret, shame. "It happens," she said. "Not cold, just tired." He nodded once, then stepped back. "If you need anything, my name's Tyler, just tap." She offered a slight smile, more with her eyes than her mouth. As he left, she let her gaze drift back to the glass. She never drank much during flights. Even the light stuff could mess with how her mind processed pressure changes. But she lifted the elderflower to her lips anyway, took a small sip. Crisp, floral, like memory disguised as luxury. A chime sounded overhead. Final boarding. The rest of the VIP cabin was nearly full now. 12 suites, a bubble of privacy that held the highest tier of business, influence, and quiet arrogance. Lacey glanced toward the front bulkhead, where 2 curtains remained closed. Beyond them, cockpit and staff compartments. Command centers for people who assumed the real power sat behind closed doors. She knew better. Real power didn't sit behind doors. It sat quietly, watched everything, and spoke only when silence wouldn't serve. Her thoughts were interrupted by another voice. Familiar. Drawn-out syllables. That voice always sounded like it belonged to someone who believed they were the main character in every room. "I don't care what the manifest says. I always fly Suite 1A. You should have confirmed before we even took off." Preston Langford again. He was near the service galley now, voice rising just enough for Lacey to catch every word. She didn't look, didn't engage. Heather's voice followed, not as loud, but urgent, trying to smooth him down. "We understand, Mr. Langford, and again, I do apologize. Your assistant didn't indicate a suite preference when booking. The suite was claimed several days ago." "There's something off about this. That woman didn't even have the right name on her pass. You said it said Elijah." "It's not our place to question identity once verified," Heather cut in, her tone tightening. "'Cause she's not Elijah." "Sir, please. Don't serve me. I've donated to Altura's loyalty programs for over 2 decades. I know the CEO." Lacey raised one eyebrow. It wasn't even the insult. It was the familiarity with which he claimed the space, the plane, the people, as if his money had etched invisible rules into the walls and floors, and now someone had walked through his architecture without permission. She went back to the deck on her screen, scrolled past the energy storage figures, and opened a secondary tab, internal communications from her legal team. Just before she boarded, they'd flagged a statement Heliox had quietly released in Zurich. Nothing public, just a 1-paragraph footnote in an international energy journal, but the language mattered. Pending further review of equity terms due to regional reassessment, which was lawyer speak for "we're getting cold feet." Lacey exhaled, not because it was unexpected, but because it meant she'd need to shift the tone of the meeting tomorrow. Less handshake, more hard line. She glanced at the time. Still 15 minutes until takeoff. Long enough for Langford to embarrass himself again. Outside the tinted window, a line of runway lights glowed faintly in the evening air. The hum of jet turbines began to rise, the kind of vibration you felt in your bones before your ears caught on. There was something holy about that sound, the promise of movement, of distance. She thought about how far she'd come, how many rooms she'd entered where people assumed she was the assistant, or the intern, or the guest, and how often she'd stayed silent, waiting for the moment they realized the meeting wouldn't start until she spoke. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising, but it still made her tired. She leaned her head back and let her eyes close for a moment. The quiet now was the good kind, the kind that lets you breathe deep, let your muscles loosen, let you remember who you were without interruption. That quiet, of course, wouldn't last. Not with people like Langford aboard. But Lacey didn't mind. She didn't need peace. She needed altitude. The plane hadn't left the ground, but the tension in the cabin had already ascended. Lacey kept her eyes shut, not from fatigue, but from choice, a practiced stillness. The world had taught her early that people spoke differently when they thought you weren't listening, and right now, Preston Langford was still talking. She was defiant. "That's the word for it," he said from somewhere behind the curtain. "Didn't even blink when I explained who I was." Heather murmured something low, unintelligible through the hum of the engines powering up. Lacey didn't need the exact words to understand the cadence. Placation wrapped in protocol. A smile behind clenched teeth. She'd heard it 1,000 times at fundraising galas, investor mixers, leadership retreats. The way people tried to manage entitled men without ever challenging them, not to avoid conflict, just to keep the illusion of control. The jet vibrated slightly as the cabin pressure adjusted. First class settled into a hush of movement. Tablets being docked, glasses refilled, headrests fluffed by crew. Lacey's eyes opened slowly. Her reflection ghosted in the dark screen of her tablet, poised, alert, and unimpressed. Her hand moved to the leather folder beside her. She pulled out the page of handwritten notes she'd drafted at the hotel in San Francisco. Not business notes. Personal. Mantras. Not affirmations in the self-help sense, but truths she grounded herself in when the air around her grew thin. Proximity doesn't equal power. Do not rise to meet disrespect. Let it fall beneath you. Legacy over ego. She folded the page back into the sleeve and glanced toward the front of the suite. The curtain had parted slightly, just enough to see Preston gesturing with one hand while holding his phone in the other. Still talking, probably typing a dramatic text to someone equally insufferable. 30 million in annual donations, she heard him say. You'd think that would matter. Then, just as the curtain began to swing closed again, he looked up. Their eyes met. Brief, sharp, intentional. Lacey didn't look away. Preston did. The curtain snapped shut. The plane began to taxi. This was a slow crawl down the runway, as if the jet itself could feel the tension on board and was reluctant to commit to the journey. The cabin lighting dimmed, replaced with soft blue glows at floor level. Screens flickered to life with safety demonstrations, voiced over in soft corporate cadence. Lacey didn't watch. She'd flown enough miles to memorize every angle of the exit doors and oxygen mask placements. Instead, she kept her gaze forward, neutral, calm. The voice came from her left. I admire how you handled that. Lacey turned slightly. A woman in her mid-60s occupied Suite 1B. Sharp cheekbones, steel gab hair, and a bun that meant business. She wore a dark navy pantsuit with no visible brand, no flashy accessories, just a subtle elegance that didn't ask for approval. I've been flying this route for years, the woman continued. Langford's the same every time, but they usually move people around him. You're the first I've seen who didn't budge. Lacey smiled faintly. Not in the habit of budging. The woman extended a hand across the divider. Clara Whitmore, I'm with the UN Clean Energy Council. Lacey's brow lifted, intrigued. Lacey Christensen. Solvanta Energy. Clara chuckled. I know. There was something refreshing about that. Not just the recognition, but the lack of performative surprise. Clara didn't blink, didn't fumble through fake praise or questions that disguised doubt. She simply nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. I've followed your work with the Nairobi grid realignment, Clara said. That was, well, it rattled some cages in Brussels. Good, Lacey replied. Some cages needed rattling. They shared a brief silence, not awkward but deliberate. Then Claire leaned back and closed her eyes. If things get messy, I'm in 1B. Feel free to knock. Lacey nodded once, then turned back to her space. It wasn't every day she met someone on a plane who spoke her language without translation. The jet began its final turn onto the runway. The engines roared, not aggressive, but confident. A controlled surge. Takeoff. The cabin pulled gently against her shoulders as the plane climbed, nose up, into the sky. City lights fell away beneath them, blurring into patterns like artificial constellations. Lacey inhaled deeply through her nose, held it, exhaled slowly. In the air, her thoughts were sharper. The noise of the ground never followed her past 10,000 feet, except tonight. It had. 7 minutes into flight, the seatbelt chime dinged off. The cabin crew began moving again, like clockwork, serving champagne and checking call buttons. Lacey adjusted her recliner, opened her laptop, and began drafting a response memo to her Zurich legal liaison. She was halfway through a sentence when the curtain rustled again. This time, she didn't look up. Heather's voice drifted into her suite. Ms. Christensen, I wanted to follow up on earlier. Just to make sure everything's in order for you now. Lacey didn't turn. She continued typing as she answered. Everything was in order before. A pause. Heather stepped closer, just inside the threshold. Yes, of course. I meant, well, we just want to ensure our elite guests feel supported. Support, Lacey replied. Doesn't look like letting a man claim a seat that wasn't his. Heather flushed slightly, though she tried to hold her smile. Understood. I'll make a note for crew training. Again, we sincerely... Us gains. Heather blinked. Lacey finally turned, her gaze cool and level. I don't need a polished apology. I need your crew not to default to suspicion when they see someone like me in 1A. Heather's mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. I'm not looking for restitution, Lacey added, but I am paying attention, and so are others. That last sentence wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. Heather stepped back. Of course, thank you for your feedback. She disappeared behind the curtain. Lacey resumed typing. She didn't need to get loud. Loudness was easy to dismiss, but documentation, memory, that was something different. She copied Heather's full name into her notes, along with timestamps. Not to weaponize, but to keep a record. Because accountability didn't start in courtrooms or headlines. It started with remembering. She reached for her water, took a sip, then glanced once more at her reflection in the black tablet screen. SCOCOM. Still rising, Preston Langford had finally stopped talking. For now. Lacey didn't trust silences like that. Not from men like him. His kind never backed down quietly. They withdrew only long enough to strategize, to reframe the same condescension as diplomacy. The sudden quiet wasn't surrender. It was recalibration. The cabin lights shifted into their post-takeoff glow, a soft amber hue meant to imitate sunset, no matter what time it actually was. Across the aisle, a young man removed his jacket with the exaggerated flair of someone used to being noticed. He glanced over at Lacey's suite. Their eyes didn't meet, but she could feel the flicker of interest. She was used to that, too. The double takes, the curious stares, the sideways calculations. Always the same question dancing behind their eyes. Who is she? Not who are you, as in identity, but how did you get here? A crew member pushed a cart slowly down the center aisle, a symphony of glasses clinking, soft apologies, quiet laughter. In the cabin of the powerful, even indulgence was choreographed. Lacey had returned to her documents, adjusting variables in a global cost disruption model. Her fingers moved swiftly, eyes scanning for weak points in the merger agreement. The Heliox team was known for last-minute clause reversals. She wasn't about to give them even 0.5% of unexpected ground. Then, a shadow fell across her screen. It was subtle, just enough to darken the edge of the lighted display. Someone had entered her space again. "Excuse me," came Heather Gaines's voice. Too sweet, like it had been rehearsed. Lacey didn't look up right away. She saved her work, closed the file, then tapped the screen off. Her patience wasn't gone. It had simply finished aging. Heather stood with that plastic smile she wore like a mask. "We've had a situation come up with one of our elite partners. Mr. Langford's assistant accidentally booked his suite incorrectly. He's understandably upset. We're hoping we can resolve this without escalating the matter." There was, in the ask, the setup. Lacey waited, expressionless. Heather shifted her weight. "We'd like to request, politely, of course, if you'd be willing to allow Mr. Langford to return to Suite 1A. We can offer you 1C instead. It's directly across, equal amenities, and we'll include a complimentary voucher for future prestige travel. Plus, we'd like to extend our sincerest..." The word was calm, firm, carved from something immovable. Heather blinked. "I'm sorry? I'm not moving," Lacey said. "Not to 1C, not for a voucher, not for him." Heather's smile began to crack. "I understand, but..." "No, you don't," Lacey said, her voice still quiet but edged now. "You're asking a paying passenger to surrender a confirmed, secured seat for someone who simply believes they deserve it more. That's not a customer service issue. That's a values issue. If you say, 'Oh,'" The curtain behind Heather twitched. Preston Langford stepped into view. "Oh, come on," he said with that trademark scoff. "There's no need to be unreasonable." He wasn't speaking to Heather anymore, he was speaking at Lacey, loud enough for others to hear. Performative. "You got your moment," he said. "You made your point. Let's not drag this out." Lacey turned slightly in her seat. "You believe me keeping my assigned seat is a performance?" she asked. Langford gave a half laugh. "I believe you're making something out of nothing. It's just a chair." Lacey studied him, and for a moment he faltered. There was a depth in her stillness that most people didn't know how to navigate. "If it's just a chair," she said evenly, "then sit in the one you were given." Langford's jaw tightened. The flush in his neck started to rise toward his face. "I've flown this suite for 15 years. People know me here." "I'm not people," she replied. Heather interjected too quickly. "Miss Christensen, we really would appreciate your cooperation. This situation is..." "Uncomfortable?" Lacey asked, finally turning her full attention to the attendant. "It's uncomfortable to tell a black woman to move out of a seat she paid for so a white man can be comfortable again?" Several heads in first class shifted. There was a pause, a weight in the air now. Not tension. Truth. Heather paled. "It's not about race," she said too quickly, her voice suddenly thinner. "It never is until it is," Lacey said. Preston raised both palms. "Now wait a damn minute." "You've been given your minute," Lacey replied. "Several, in fact. And what did you do with them? You accused, you assumed, you insisted." Preston's hands lowered, fists slowly forming. "I'm not going to stand here and be insulted," he muttered. "You've been standing here and insulting me since the moment I sat down," Lacey replied. "But sure, leave now if it helps your feelings recover." He stared at her, his mouth half open, as if words were forming but refusing to cooperate. Then came a voice from behind them. "Hence?" "She's right." Clara Whitmore had stood up. Her tone was even but carried weight. "You can't ask someone to surrender what they've earned because another person is louder about deserving it. Especially not in a cabin where half the people have never heard no in their lives." Langford turned, caught off guard. "Excuse me, but I don't believe this concerns you." Clara tilted her head slightly. "It concerns anyone who values fairness." A second voice chimed in. "It's not just about the seat," said a man from 2A. "It's about what this airline stands for." Heather looked overwhelmed now. Her eyes darted toward the galley. "Searching for help." Langford gritted his teeth. "This is absurd." Lacey reached for her drink, took a sip, set it down again. "Not absurd," she said. "Exhausting. That's what it is." Preston finally stepped back. The curtain shifted, closed behind him with an irritated snap. Heather hesitated, then bowed slightly. "I'll inform the crew that the matter is settled." Lacey gave her nothing. The attendant turned and walked away. The cabin remained still for a long moment, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Lacey leaned back. In her mind, she went back to her list. Legacy over ego. And in this moment, ego had just been grounded. The curtain never quite settled after Langford disappeared behind it. It fluttered, now and then, disturbed by unseen hands moving beyond it. Flight attendants relaying updates, glances exchanged, hushed decisions unfolding in quiet panic. Something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the current flowing underneath it. Lacey didn't celebrate her small victory. Not here. Not now. What had happened wasn't a win. It was a refusal to lose. There was a difference. She reached for her notebook, not the digital kind, but a slim, matte-thickened moleskin bound in red thread. Inside were thoughts not meant for slides or strategy decks, scribbled fragments of clarity, quotes she'd heard in passing, reminders of what it cost to stand still when the world tried to move you. She flipped to a blank page, uncapped her pen, and wrote, "Being asked to leave isn't the worst part. It's being expected to smile when you do." She paused, the tip of her pen hovering, then added beneath it, "I didn't smile." Across the aisle, Clara returned to her seat with the effortless grace of someone who had fought bigger battles in boardrooms across continents. She didn't look over, didn't offer a knowing nod. She didn't need to. The silence between them had already become its own kind of solidarity. A few rows back, Langford's voice continued, softer now, but still audible in waves, more subdued, no longer shouting but still seething. You could always tell when someone had been embarrassed but not humbled. It came out in the way they whispered, like they were trying to build a case out of broken pride. Lacey returned to her files. The Zurich contract still had loose corners that needed tightening. If she gave the Heliox team too much space to stall, they'd try to leverage the delay into better equity terms. That couldn't happen. Not when Solvanta had done the heavy lifting across 3 continents. Not when her tech had proven itself under the harshest regulatory climates. Not when her name had been carved into every meaningful milestone of the deal. A quiet ding. The seatbelt sign turned off, cabin lights dimmed further. She reached for her phone, opened her secure messaging app, and drafted a quick update to Marcus. In flight. Incident. W/Altura crew. Small storm, handled. Prepare press pivot just in case. Zurich brief is priority. Add rider to equity clause. No wiggle room. She hit send, then leaned back and allowed herself a long, deep breath. "Another drink, Mom?" Lacey opened her eyes. Tyler, the attendant who had quietly supported her earlier, now stood beside her with the drink cart, avoiding eye contact but speaking with genuine politeness. "No, thank you," she replied. He paused, then cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "a lot of us saw what happened. Not everyone agreed with how it was handled." She met his gaze. "But no one said anything." He looked down. "I know." Lacey nodded, just once. It wasn't blame. It was fact. He poured her water anyway, set it on the edge of the console, and disappeared down the aisle. The hum of the engine grew steady now, background noise blending into the mood lighting and subtle tapping of cutlery on ceramic plates. Around her, other passengers had returned to their rituals, watching movies, scrolling portfolios, pretending they hadn't witnessed what they all had. That was always the quiet agreement in elite spaces. Witnessing injustice wasn't the sin. Acknowledging it out loud was. Lacey tapped the window screen to let in the view. City lights had long since vanished below them. Now only darkness stretched out, the soft velvet kind that cradled the plane like a secret. It was peaceful, above the noise, above the politics, above the weight. She liked that part of flying. The altitude always stripped things down. In the sky, power looked less like wealth and more like will. Another chime. But this one was different. The intercom clicked on, followed by a pause that stretched a beat too long. Then a voice. Not the usual flight captain, but someone new. Female, confident, mid-30s perhaps. "Good evening, passengers. This is First Officer Wells. We'd like to thank you for flying Altura Skies, and we hope your journey is smooth and restorative. We're cruising at 37,000 feet and expect a calm passage to Geneva. Meal service will begin shortly. As always, if there's anything we can do to elevate your experience, don't hesitate to let us know." Brief silence, then whispers resumed. Lacey closed her eyes for a moment. She knew how messages were timed in flight. That wasn't just a welcome. It was a redirection. Something had happened in the cockpit. Some internal thread pulled. She could feel it. She opened her email and refreshed her inbox. A new message waited at the top. Subject: your Altura experience. From customer.relations@alturaskies.com. Time, 9:21 p.m. PST. Lacey opened it. Dear Miss Christensen, we are aware of an earlier incident involving your assigned seating on Flight 927. Please know this matter is being reviewed by our Executive Guest Relations team. Altura Skies holds a firm commitment to equity, inclusion, and dignity for all our travelers. Our Chief Customer Officer, Danielle Carson, has been notified and will be personally reviewing the circumstances surrounding the experience. We will follow up within 48 hours. With sincere apologies and respect. Altura Guest Experience. She read it twice, not because she needed to, but because of what wasn't there. No direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No mention of Langford. No accountability yet, just noise control. Still, Danielle Carson. That was a name. She hadn't heard it in a while. Carson was a rising figure in airline executive circles, known for tough calls and even tougher silence. If she was being looped in mid-flight, something bigger was stirring. Lacey smiled to herself. Not out of satisfaction, just recognition. Power was watching now. Across the aisle, Clara sipped from a fresh glass of white wine, glanced at Lacey without turning her head, and raised one eyebrow in silent question. Lacey returned the gesture with the faintest tilt of her chin. Not yet. And soon. She set her glass down, folded her hands, and waited. It began with the click of polished shoes. Not a march, not even a purposeful stride, just the slow, steady rhythm of someone approaching with enough confidence to believe they wouldn't be denied. The curtain swayed open again, like it had been biding time for this moment. Lacey didn't look up right away. She already knew who it was. Preston Langford stepped into the aisle beside her suite, flanked now by a different flight attendant, a tall man with close-cropped hair and a strained smile. Not Tyler. This one was older, higher-rankled, judging by the gold bands on his sleeve and the clipped pace of his words. Miss Christensen, the man said, bending slightly at the waist like he'd rehearsed the gesture in front of a mirror. We wanted to revisit your seating arrangement. There's been an internal request to relocate you to another suite. Lacey set her tablet down, carefully, deliberately, then lifted her gaze to meet his. Another request, she said, the words flat. Preston smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You've made your point, no harm done, but the airline is offering an opportunity to smooth this over quietly. Lacey didn't answer. The attendant cleared his throat. It's Suite 3A, still within prestige. You'll maintain full access to all services. She stared at them both, unmoving. Preston leaned closer to the divider. There's no need to turn this into a crusade. You're clearly accomplished. Let's not pretend this is about principle. It's ego. Yours. Lacey's face didn't change, but inside her, something taut and quiet began to pull. She turned her attention to the attendant. Is this an order? He flinched slightly. No, ma'am, we're simply asking. No, you're not. You're repositioning. A few passengers nearby stirred. Clara had turned her head. The man in 2A angled slightly in his seat. You don't need to do this, Lacey continued, still calm. You don't need to reinforce his entitlement. You don't need to tell a black woman for the second time in the same flight that her confirmed, purchased, secured seat is less valuable than a white man's comfort. The attendant swallowed. Preston waved his hand. That's not what this is about. Lacey turned to him now. Then what's it about? He opened his mouth but paused. His expression faltered, just long enough to betray that he didn't have a ready answer. Or at least, not one that wouldn't make him sound worse. This is becoming disruptive, the attendant said, voice lower now. No, Lacey replied. This became disruptive the moment your staff let him challenge my presence without verification. It became disruptive when your lead attendant took his word over my boarding pass. It became disruptive when you showed up instead of a supervisor with enough spine to say no to him. The man straightened. I'm following a protocol for customer conflict mitigation. Lacey folded her hands in her lap. Then follow it evenly. Another silence. Behind her, a call bell dinged from somewhere in the cabin. A ripple of sound began to spread. Not noise, but attention. Something was happening, something different from the normal rhythms of air travel. Eyes were shifting now. Conversations quieted. The attendant stepped back half a pace. Preston remained, rigid, uncertain for the first time. You're refusing the transfer? The attendant asked. I'm refusing to surrender, she said. There was no raised voice, no anger. Yes, resolve. The attendant nodded once, more to himself than anyone, and walked away without another word. Preston lingered. Then, realizing the optics had turned, he hissed, You're just looking for a scene. Lacey leaned forward just slightly. You're mistaking scene for stance. I don't perform, Mr. Langford. I hold ground. She picked up her tablet again. He left. The curtain snapped closed, harder this time. The pressure in the cabin felt different now. Claren leaned over slightly. He doesn't know what to do with the word no. Lacey didn't respond. She opened her inbox. There was another message from Altura, this time from someone named Nina Forrester, with a CC to Danielle Carson. Subject: Escalation notice. Internal monitoring triggered. Time: 10:07 p.m. PST. She read the first line twice. We've been made aware of multiple conflicting reports from Flight 927. Please be advised that all crew communications from the previous 45 minutes are now under review. Lacey blinked. That wasn't a customer service response. That was an internal alert. Her fingers moved swiftly. She replied directly to Danielle Carson. To dcarson@alturaskies.com. Subject: internal monitoring. Internal monitor. Danielle, appreciate the follow-up. Please include audio logs between 9:20 and 10:10 PST in your review. Crew members involved: Heather Gaines, unknown male attendant, likely lead Prestige, and passenger Preston Langford. My seating confirmation was never revoked. I expect the airline to acknowledge this discrepancy publicly. LC. She hit send, then leaned back and closed her eyes. It wasn't over, but now there was a record, a formal escalation, which meant even if they never apologized, she'd still disrupted the system. At 30,000 feet, above oceans and countries, she had refused to vanish. It was a strange kind of power, to still be seen, to still be in your seat. For the next few minutes, the air thickened, not from turbulence, but from tension. It was a kind of invisible weight that settled between the seats, clung to the aisle, and stretched across the cabin like a fog people tried to pretend wasn't there. Lacey could feel it press against her ribs every time someone walked past her suite, and slowed just a bit. That slight hesitation, the lingering glance, the silent question. They all knew something had happened. But in first class, no one ever asked directly. Questions here wore cufflinks and came wrapped in small talk. Polite curiosity. Polished denial. Always watching, never saying. Lacey returned her attention to her screen, but her thoughts drifted. She wasn't worried. She was calculating. Not whether things would escalate further, she was past that point, but how deeply this incident had already embedded itself into the airline's internal system. Emails had been triggered, crew behavior had already been flagged. Somewhere, someone with real authority was reading transcripts, and someone else was probably panicking. The calm that settled over her was unexpected, not relief, clarity. She wasn't just defending her seat anymore. She was holding up a mirror to a system that had never expected to see itself so clearly from this angle. Especially not at 37,000 feet. She scrolled through her phone, checking recent downloads, news alerts, market updates, social sentiment scans on Solvanta. Nothing unusual. But buried at the bottom of her feed was a single notification she hadn't seen come in. Danielle Carson has viewed your LinkedIn profile. Lacey smirked. Subtle, but not meaningless. Danielle Carson, Chief Customer Officer of Altura Skies, wasn't a small player. She had built her name on redefining luxury travel through accountability and personalization, the kind of executive who didn't speak until she had the whole picture. And when she did, her word was final. If Danielle was looking into her, the situation had already moved past the PR desk. It was in executive hands now. The lights in the cabin shifted again, dimmed further for sleep hours, though few actually slept. The hush that fell over the prestige cabin was different this time, more conscious, like everyone knew they should be quiet, but not why. She glanced across the aisle. Clara was still awake, pretending to read a novel she hadn't turned a page of in over an hour. She caught Lacey's eye, gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement, then returned her gaze to the open book. Beyond her, toward the rear of the cabin, movement caught Lacey's attention. A man stood up slowly from Suite 4C. He wore a navy business jacket with no tie, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like the others, not frantic, not curious. Intentional. He stepped into the aisle, waited as a flight attendant passed by, then began walking toward the galley at the front of the cabin. Lacey didn't know him, but something about him felt different. She followed him with her eyes until he disappeared behind the curtain. A moment later, she heard it, the ding of the service call bell. Someone else in the cabin had just pressed it. Not her, not Langford. Someone else. Lacey turned slightly, scanning the cabin. A woman in Suite 2B was adjusting her blanket. A man in 3A sipped from a glass and watched the ceiling. No one looked particularly bothered, but someone had initiated that call, and whoever had answered it was now behind the curtain, caught in a longer than usual delay. Seconds ticked. Then the curtain opened again, and the man from 4C re-emerged. Only now, he wasn't alone. Behind him, walking with a kind of casual authority that didn't quite match her airline blazer, was a woman in her 40s. Shoulder-length hair clipped at the sides, black slacks instead of a skirt, a badge without a name visible. Her expression was unreadable, but her body language spoke volumes. She wasn't crew. She was watching the crew. She paused at the galley, whispered something to the lead attendant. The man nodded, then gestured toward the front of the plane. The woman glanced around the cabin, briefly. Then her eyes landed on Lacey. They didn't move. Lacey met her gaze, steady and without question. The woman gave a single, imperceptible nod, withdraw, and walked away. Clara stirred slightly across the aisle. "That looked interesting," she murmured without looking up. "I think the cabin just got its audit," Lacey said. "I figured. They were too slow to react. Someone above them is now reacting for them." Lacey sipped her water. That someone might be in this cabin? It was quiet again, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just about Langford anymore. It wasn't even about the attendants. It was about Altura Skies now, the whole brand. Somewhere inside that plane, someone with decision-making authority was watching how the crew handled elite conflict. Someone was taking notes, reviewing reactions, listening for apologies that never came, watching the subtle differences in how service was delivered, how passengers were addressed, how escalation was framed, and who it favored. Lacey checked her inbox again. No new emails. But the silence spoke just as loudly. She leaned back and allowed herself a long breath. No storm raged, no shouting, just silence. Corporate silence. That was the kind that moved mountains. If you knew how to listen. She didn't need to make another complaint. She didn't need to call a lawyer. The work had already started. Their findings from behind curtains, with audit reports, with eyes now fully open. At 37,000 feet, the altitude hadn't changed, but the attitude had. And Lacey was still in her seat. Somewhere between the Atlantic Ocean and the first whispers of European airspace, the flight began to feel longer than scheduled. Not in hours, but in weight. The kind of heaviness that came when systems cracked under pressure, and everyone on board pretended not to hear it. It had been quiet for over 45 minutes, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that hummed under your skin. Lacey sat perfectly still. She hadn't touched her tablet in 15 minutes. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at the documents anymore. She was watching movement, listening, calculating. Tyler, the soft-spoken attendant from earlier, passed by her suite again. This time he didn't pause, but as he walked past, she noticed a small, subtle detail. No drink cart, no tray, just a folded napkin in his hand, held like a prop, an excuse. He wasn't serving anymore. He was scouting. She followed his path with her eyes as he moved toward the galley. He didn't speak to Heather, who stood stiff behind the partition like someone waiting for sentencing. He walked past her and turned down the narrow crew hallway that led to the cockpit access area. Then he vanished behind the door. Lacey's chest rose slowly, then fell. That wasn't protocol. Flight attendants didn't wander to the cockpit this late in the flight unless summoned, or unless something was about to change. Clara, who had been dozing across the aisle, stirred again. This time she looked more alert. "They're moving strangely," she said under her breath. "They've been moving strangely since we boarded," Lacey replied. "No," Clara said, lowering her voice. "This is different. They're trying to act normal. That's when you know it's not." Just then, the curtain at the front of the cabin parted again. The woman in black slacks, the one without a name tag, returned. She didn't speak to anyone. Didn't smile. She walked directly to Suite 4C, bent low, and exchanged a few whispered words with a man who had triggered the earlier call bell. He nodded once, then opened his phone. In place to call. Right there in the cabin. The signal light on the phone screen confirmed it. Mid-flight access granted. The man's voice was calm, measured. A few yeses, a single pause, then a quiet, "Confirmed." He ended the call. Seconds later, he stood and walked directly into the galley. This time, he didn't close the curtain behind him. The tension in the air turned sharp, not loud, but electric, the kind of tension that lives just beneath the surface before a ripple breaks. Tyler returned from the cockpit moments later. He walked faster now, his eyes locked forward. No napkin this time, just urgency barely hidden behind calm movements. He disappeared behind the other curtain. Lacey checked her inbox again. Nothing new. She opened a secure folder on her tablet, an archive of Altura Skies corporate structures she had kept on hand after a keynote event she'd spoken at 2 years ago. She'd been a guest speaker for one of their partner summits. They'd praised her for her innovation, called her a visionary, promised future collaborations. She'd left that stage to a standing ovation. And yet a man named Preston Langford had still tried to move her from her seat like she was invisible. She scrolled through the org chart until she found the name she was looking for. Jonathan Mercer, VP of Global Security Operations. Based, London. She cross-referenced the man from Suite 4C, looked again at his watch, the visible Altura pin on his jacket collar, the subtle earpiece that hadn't been there earlier. He wasn't a passenger. He was Mercer, or someone working directly under him. Clara leaned forward slightly. "You're reading them right?" "They're investigating internally," Lacey said, "and documenting everything." Lacey nodded, "which means one thing. They already know the outcome," Clara finished. Silence stretched between them again. Not empty. Ready. A few rows ahead, Heather tried to resume drink service. Her smile looked painted now, fragile. Her hands moved with just a bit too much stiffness. She approached a middle-aged couple in Suite 2C and poured wine, her voice pitched higher than usual, forced. The woman barely sipped. The man didn't drink at all. When Heather turned to the next row, she locked eyes with Mercer. Her smile froze. He motioned her aside. Just one finger. No words. She obeyed. Lacey watched it unfold in fragments. Heather walking toward the galley with slow, stiff steps. Mercer following behind. The woman with no name tag joining last, drawing the curtain quietly closed. They didn't come out for 15 minutes. In that time, no one moved. Not the passengers, not the crew. Even the ones pretending to sleep shifted less. The hum of the plane was the only sound, interrupted occasionally by the faint clinking of ice somewhere in the back. When the curtain finally opened, Mercer stepped out first. He didn't look left or right. Just walked calmly toward Suite 1A. It stopped. Lacey closed her tablet and looked up. He extended a hand. "Mrs. Christensen, my name is David Mercer. I work in executive operations with Altura. I want to personally apologize for the experience you've had during this flight." Lacey didn't shake his hand. She didn't need to. "I'm aware of who you are," she said. Mercer nodded, not offended. "We've reviewed the crew's handling of this incident. I'm here to let you know that decisions have been made." "What kind of decisions?" "The kind that start in the air and end on the ground." She stared at him. He added, "I won't ask you to move. I won't ask you to forget. But I will ask that you allow us to correct our error." Behind him, Heather stood quietly by the galley wall, her face pale, her hands folded tightly. The male attendant who had tried to relocate Lacey earlier stood beside her. Both were no longer speaking. Mercer looked toward them, then back at Lacey. "There will be changes," he said. "You'll be informed of them once we land." Lacey said nothing. She didn't smile, didn't nod. Mercer bowed his head once, then stepped away. The curtain closed behind him. Clara exhaled across the aisle. "And that, my dear," she whispered, was the sound of someone getting fired. Lacey didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she already knew it was true. Geneva was still a few hours away, but the descent had already begun. Not the mechanical one announced over the intercom with a seatbelt ding and landing procedures. This descent was different, quieter, more human. It was the kind that happened when people realized they had nowhere else to hide. Masks slipped, smiles faltered, power shifted. And no one could stop it. Heather was no longer visible in the main cabin. Gone was her practiced grin and the tight bun that had refused to move during turbulence. Now she remained behind the curtain like a student waiting for expulsion, her shadow flickering briefly when someone moved past the galley. Her presence had once commanded the aisle like she owned it. Now she had become a passenger on her own crew. The other flight attendants moved slower now, their steps deliberate, their voices lower. Some no longer made eye contact with passengers. Others avoided Suite 1A entirely, adjusting course as if gravity had changed near Lacey's space. It hadn't, but something else had. Something unspoken, undeniable. Lacey noticed every detail. The sudden absence of unnecessary questions. The way no one dared offer her another drink or disturb her with empty gestures. She wasn't just seen now, she was known. And that, more than anything, made people nervous. She sat poised, legs crossed, tablet dark. She wasn't working anymore. Not out of exhaustion, but choice. Everything she needed to do had already been done. The calls had been made, the reports submitted. The right eyes had witnessed enough. And the wrong ones had been caught in the act. Across from her, Clara gave a knowing glance. "They're unraveling." They should be, Lacey said softly. It's rare, Clara added, seeing consequence actually arrive in real time. Usually it gets buried behind doors or traded off in favors. They didn't expect this to go beyond the cabin, Lacey said. They expected me to stay quiet, move seats, smile for the optics. And you didn't. Lacey shook her head. I'm tired of shrinking to make other people feel comfortable. Clara nodded slowly, then leaned back, hands folded across her lap. You're changing something, you know. Not just this airline. The story's going to outlive the flight. I'm not chasing headlines. No, Clara said, but the truth likes to run and head. The curtain opened briefly. A male attendant, not Tyler, but one of the younger ones, peeked out, whispered something to the supervisor in the aisle, and then disappeared again. The woman who had accompanied Mercer earlier now stood near the front bulkhead, arms crossed, watching everything. Her expression hadn't changed since the last time Lacey saw her, unreadable, professional. But her silence held authority. Then came the sound. Not loud, not obvious, just a quiet double ding and the smooth voice of the pilot. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received our final weather confirmation for arrival into Geneva. We'll begin our official descent in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain seated as our crew begins final preparations. Click. The ding echoed in the silence, but Lacey could feel it. That moment when people realized the flight was almost over, and what waited on the other side might not be what they'd planned. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, scrolled past the business briefs, past the merger memos. She found the note she had started the night before in the hotel room in San Francisco, just hours before boarding. I've been drinking and morphing. It had been titled, If I'm Tested Again. She'd typed only 2 lines back then. Stay calm, let your power be undeniable. Now she added a third, and let them fear the silence that follows. She closed the app, set the phone down, and looked out the window. The black of night had softened just slightly. A faint blue glow clung to the edge of the clouds. Morning was waiting. Did you hear? Clara's voice came again, quieter now. The woman near the cockpit. She's not just a corporate rep. That's Carson. Lacey turned. Danielle? Clara nodded once, confirmed. I overheard one of the junior crew whispering. They're terrified. And he was auditing the route. She was auditing everything. Lacey absorbed that. Of course Danielle would be on board. Altura Skies had been rolling out a new luxury protocol for international elite passengers, and Geneva was one of their primary routes for showcasing high-tier service. The route had been under scrutiny for months, investors watching, partners evaluating. What better way to observe the experience than to blend in, to pose as just another high-ranking corporate rep, quietly watching the truth unfold? Danielle had seen it all. The false courtesy, the preferential treatment, the forced smiles that turned into silent compliance. She had seen it all, and she had seen Lacey never flinch. The consequences had already begun. Another email arrived. Lacey tapped her phone screen. Subject, internal memo. Immediate action. From danielle.carson@alturaskies.com. Time, 3:22 IEM ESCT. Mrs. Christensen, please accept this brief message ahead of our formal correspondence. I have personally reviewed the events of this flight, as well as the crew response and prior conduct history. Actions are already underway. This will not happen again. Not to you, nor to anyone else who dares to sit where they belong. I'll speak to you directly upon landing. With respect, Danielle Carson, Chief Customer Officer. Altura Skies International. Lacey stared at the message. It wasn't grand. It wasn't legal. It was quiet and decisive. It was enough. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just closed the email and leaned back in her chair. Let the descent continue. Let the cabin prepare. Let the morning break wide open. Because when the wheels finally touched down, something else would land with them. Accountability. The plane made its final approach into Geneva, cutting through the night sky like a sleek, silent bird of prey. There was no sign of turbulence, only the quiet hum of engines shifting into the final stretch. But in the cabin, the air felt heavier with each passing second. Passengers straightened in their seats, gathering belongings, readjusting their collars, smoothing out wrinkles, preparing themselves for the inevitable landing. Lacey didn't move. Her posture was already perfect, her thoughts calm, but her mind still calculated. Her fingers rested on her lap as her phone vibrated again. This time a text from Marcus. Marcus Bell, we've confirmed Carson's role. Word's already out in media circles about the incident. Prepare for media interest once we land. I've got a PR team on standby. Lacey read it, set the phone down, and exhaled slowly. It didn't surprise her. If anything, it was exactly what she had anticipated. A few whispers in the right places, and people would start connecting the dots. The audacious behavior of a wealthy, entitled passenger and an airline complicit in his actions wasn't the kind of thing you could easily sweep under the rug. It would make headlines, it would stir up conversations, and Altura Skies would have to deal with it. The jet descended through the night sky, cutting its way through the thick cloud cover, gently veering toward the runways of Geneva International Airport. For a brief moment, Lacey closed her eyes. She didn't need to look out the window to know what the world below her looked like. It was always the same when you flew at this height. Tiny lights sprawling across dark stretches of land, cities quiet but alive with movement, life unfolding far below. But here, in the quiet of the plane, everything felt different. The weight of decisions loomed large. Everything was changing. The last few hours had gone by in a blur of tense silences and long, measured breaths. But now, as the plane angled its descent toward the earth, it felt like everything was building toward a final release. The altitude had changed, yes, but so had the attitude. Altura Skies was no longer in control of the narrative. Not anymore. Lacey glanced at Clara, who sat across from her, still appearing composed but no longer pretending to read the novel she'd started. She looked over at Lacey, her eyes meeting hers with a nod that said more than words ever could. She'd seen it all. The passive resistance, the silent stand, the calculated movements. She had seen Lacey push through the moments when no one else could have, the unspoken tension that simmered beneath every exchange. Clara hadn't just observed. She had been part of it, standing in the silence beside Lacey, understanding exactly what it meant to not yield. The last thing you want is to land with unfinished business, Clara murmured, the words low but confident. Lacey didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her gaze drift back to the front of the cabin, where a uniformed woman, Danielle Carson, stood now, her silhouette outlined against the glow of the cockpit door. She was watching the cabin carefully, taking in the passengers and the palpable quiet. There was no more pretending. This was it. The consequences were arriving. Carson hadn't made eye contact with Lacey directly since that brief exchange earlier, but her presence now felt different, heavy, calculated. Carson was standing at the edge of the situation, waiting to see how it would end, how the pieces would land. As the plane continued its descent, Lacey could feel the rush of anticipation building. The closer they got to the ground, the clearer everything became. For all the authority and control Carson might have over Altura Skies operations, she wasn't the one who would decide how this story would be told. That power had already shifted. The final descent continued. The cabin lights flickered once as the plane leveled its approach. The altitude indicator on the side panel of the cockpit shifted downward as they prepared for landing. A final chime sounded. Then came the unmistakable voice of the flight captain, now speaking through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching Geneva International Airport. We ask that you please return your seatbacks to the upright position and fasten your seatbelts. We're expecting smooth conditions for landing. Lacey's seatbelt clicked into place. Her hands rested in her lap, calm, poised. The turbulence, if it had ever existed, had dissipated. It was just her, in the seat that had once been questioned, preparing for the next steps. Her calm wasn't a front, it was a certainty. Whatever came after this, it wasn't going to be something anyone could control. The plane neared the runway. The descent slowed, the ground creeping closer and closer. The hum of the engines shifted in pitch as the aircraft adjusted its final position, aligning for landing. The atmosphere inside the cabin tightened, and the moments between breaths began to stretch, pulling every person on board into the gravity of what was to come. Lacey's phone buzzed again, a reminder that the clock was ticking, but this time it wasn't from Marcus. It was a public notification about the incident, now making its way into the early morning news cycle. Breaking news. Altura Skies. Facing internal backlash after passenger dispute with CEO. Calls for accountability rise. Reports indicate crew missteps involving elite passenger treatment. It had started. The ripple was out there now. The story had already reached the public. Lacey didn't read further. She didn't need to. The fact that it was out there was all that mattered. The truth was free now. The public would take care of the rest. The air outside the plane would handle the consequences once they landed. And then the tires met the runway. The plane touched down smoothly, with the familiar jolt of the wheels making contact with solid ground. A brief burst of speed followed, then a gentle slowdown as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. Lacey straightened in her seat. The moment had arrived. She rose slowly from her seat and, without looking back, walked down the aisle toward the front of the cabin. Clara followed her with a casual pace, but even she could sense the gravity of the situation. No one spoke. The crew stood still, uncertain of whether they should approach or stay back. As they reached the front, the curtain at the galley opened again. Danielle Carson was standing there, waiting. She hadn't moved toward the cockpit. She hadn't walked anywhere else. She was still, watching. "I trust you had a pleasant flight," she said, her voice as smooth as it had been when Lacey first heard it earlier. Lacey didn't respond immediately. She took a moment to observe Carson. The careful, collected posture, the guarded yet composed expression. She finally spoke, her voice calm, but with the weight of everything she had carried up until this moment. "You've had time to reflect," Lacey said quietly. "And so have I." Carson's eyes narrowed slightly. "I hope you understand, Ms. Christensen, the need for review. I did not expect this to escalate." "It never had to escalate," Lacey replied, "but I won't apologize for standing my ground when it was required." There was no immediate response from Carson, no attempt at rebuttal. Lacey walked past her, her head held high. Clara followed close behind. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a quiet reclaiming of space. And in the distance, beyond the doors of the plane and the world that awaited, the shift had already begun. The consequences of this flight would echo far beyond Geneva.